It's not what I do that defines me, but what I am underneath, which is mostly the Dark Knight body sculpt. Even from its initial reveal back in late 2024 during the McFarlane Toy Show, I had to kind of shove off a little bit of my hype because this was the Batman, the movie, cinematic Batman, that I've been anticipating for quite a while outside of the other iterations because it was the only one that hasn't been checked off. We got the Dark Knight that can also kind of cover for the Dark Knight Rises. Hell, even we got Kilmer and Clooney at this point. So the only one, well, really the only two missing were Batman Begins Batman to get some representation leading up to the 20th anniversary. And then the other one was honestly just the Justice League version of the suit for Batfleck from the 2017 movie. And now one of those two has frankly been more or less shadow dropped from McFarlane, because that's probably the only other thing that did give me a little bit of reserve, a little bit of pauses, knowing that this guy just made it out to targets. I don't know if it was intentional. In fact, there's actually a good like 60 to 75% of my conscience saying that this practically was intentional to kind of generate a little bit of that scarcity, a little bit of that FOMO, collectability, if some of you want to say. There was also me, who had to wave down an employee at the third target that I finally went during a daily hunt and managed to achieve success in the form of finally getting the Batman Begins sculpt from McFarlane Toys DC Multiverse. And there was, again, still trepidation going in, knowing that I was trying to theorize how much of the Dark Knight trilogy buck that they utilized for the Build-A-Bane wave that's based off of the Dark Knight movie or the Dark Knight Rises in terms of that suit, or were they going to go for a brand new head sculpt or a brand new body, etc. And it feels like we kind of struck a little bit of a balance between column A and column B. But what makes things sort of complicated and why I feel like this figure, especially like I said, being the one that kickstarted the Dark Knight trilogy and almost exactly 20 years ago for its anniversary, no less, I feel like it deserved a little bit better because when I say that they took a little bit of column A and column B, I feel like they took the wrong parts from column B and vice versa, because there's areas where they feel very resculpted and retooled and for the betterment of the figure, but then there's others that I feel should have been left alone for the Dark Knight and not necessarily apply all that greatly to the Batman Begins. Because, first of all, you know that suit, for a lot of people, I feel like it's much more quintessential Batman than the Dark Knight trilogy one, or at least the Dark Knight Rises version, because that one had the separated panels, and it obviously fit Batman's approach to agility, being able to be a bit more flexible, being also to be a little bit more real, since Christopher Nolan was opting for realism with those movies. And I feel like as the movies went on, he started to kind of go away from that. Gotham felt more like a Gotham City in Batman Begins as opposed to just simply Chicago and Dark Knight Rises. So I feel like some of the elements in terms of like the stuff that's going on with Scarecrow and Ra's al Ghul, they started to kind of walk away with that. And I feel like amongst them, one of the victims was also the suit, because this suit, I feel, is a better Batman suit, whereas the Dark Knight and Dark Knight Rises suit is a better superhero in the real world type of suit. I feel like that's the way that I can kind of separate the two. So when McFarlane kind of brought us this, I thought to myself, okay, they really need to go all out with the paneling and the armor that he was able to kind of retrofit and emulate from his time with the League of Shadows. And you see an awful lot of that happening predominantly in the torso and thigh area, where you have much more smoothed out pieces. Granted, this resulted in a few QC issues with these little like splotches and these little kind of areas with the glistening. I don't know what it is, but I tried rubbing my hand across. I don't know if there's any kind of definitive fix for getting rid of these little things right there. So if any of you have any kind of advice to kind of buff these out, please let me know in the comments. But I mostly denoted those areas around the thighs. Once we get to like the torso, that's where I honestly feel we get my favorite part of the overall suit, which is the paneling that's very ninja-like. Like I said, lifted from the League of Shadows with a much bigger Batman symbol, or the bat symbol, because I always notice that the symbol he has in Dark Knight Rises is pretty much just the movie logo from the posters and from the marketing material, just stamped onto the panels on his chest. Whereas here, he goes for something just a little bit more predominant, a little bit more exaggerated, but also, especially with the influence of the Scarecrow toxin, a little bit more intimidating. So I always kind of preferred this symbol just a little bit better because, again, it's just much more quintessential Batman. It just strikes Batman as opposed to being a bit more minimalist with the Dark Knight and the Rises suit. Then we get to areas that I'm like, this could have been retrofitted just a little bit better. First of all, we're obviously going to be able to note the reuse of the utility belt from the Dark Knight trilogy version. The Dark Knight Build-A-Bane body, it's obviously using the exact same utility belts, and I didn't really expect anything different. If it ain't broke, don't fix it, and this is definitely one of those cases. The other areas where I do think that they actually did something a little worthwhile would have to be the gauntlets and the boots, because for the most part, they're just retools and reuses of the original Dark Knight model, except they've been given this piano finish, this glossy finish for the black, as opposed to the matted finish from the Dark Knight trilogy version. And it needed it because obviously it was much more glistening in that original Batman Begins movie, because that's when he was still utilizing so many different parts of his original League of Shadows suit. So it's cool to see that they kept that attention to detail. I just wish that attention to detail and proportion was then modeled for the biceps and the shoulder area, because I don't know if it's just me. I don't know if it's just throwing me off of how skinny and kind of out of whack his shoulder area really is, because they did their best to try to give him the much more slimmed down panels and shoulder guards that he had in that original movie. But I don't know what it is. There's just so much empty real estate, showing an awful lot of, again, reuse of the Dark Knight trilogy body, the Build-A-Bane body, because you have that little like grid pattern for the washers and the shoulder piece just right underneath right there in plain view. And sure, they kind of smoothed out a little bit of the bicep area, but it's still quintessentially the same exact sculpting and tooling of those arms. Still got the same joints connecting the elbows, and even the knee pads kind of look pretty much identical to that original Dark Knight trilogy. So for the most part, it just feels like different laser kind of sculpting and soldering happened on top of the body to then fit the Batman Begins. And like I said, some of it worked, specifically around the torso area. Some of it didn't. I do like that you have those clips that are holding the cape in place. And in person, the neck does look a little better to kind of look like it did as all one solid cowl piece did in the original Batman Begins suit. But I still hold headstrong with my original opinions back when this was initially revealed and we got our first look during that McFarlane Toy Show episode, that they should have gone for that head sculpt that is all one piece and only moves at the base of the neck. Because they've done that before. They've done it with the Hushbuck, they've done it with the Three Jokers body, where you have pretty much the neck and the head be all one solid piece and he only moves at the bottom in any kind of direction via the ball joint. If there was any movie Batman that could have benefited that, well, first of all, it would be Keaton. But then secondly, it would be Bale's Batman from Batman Begins, because he had that all one piece. It's the whole reason for why he changes it in The Dark Knight, because he wanted to be able to turn his head and get out of the driveway a lot quicker, like he mentioned. So to see that, yeah, the neck does look a little bit better in person, but then right above it, you still have the cut from the head sculpt. That is essentially the exact same head sculpt from the Dark Knight body. Again, it's that exact same sculpting. Maybe it looks a little cleaner. Maybe the eyes are just a little bit more open. But apart from that, it's the exact same head just planted on there. And even though the neck doesn't look as skinny as it did in those initial photos, and they managed to girth it up just ever so slightly, there's still a part of me that just wishes or just kind of daydreams of what it would have been like if we had gotten that uniform piece to make it look more like it did in Batman Begins. Even with a little bit of the additional kind of spikiness or the little added piece right here that kind of points down towards the cape here on the backside, that is very essential to that Batman Begins look. And then speaking of which, we do have the cape, which is unfortunately a nylon cape and not necessarily a pleated cloth cape, but nevertheless, you still have the wires on the side to be able to kind of coil it. And I will admit that in order to kind of mask a little bit of the skinniness and emptiness of those shoulders, the cape does a pretty decent job, a serviceable job of being able to kind of encompass the shoulders to give him a little bit of width, a little bit of more of that bestial, intimidating look that he had in that original Batman Begins movie. But I still wish that they would have found a way to kind of bring the cape a little bit more forward. That way he has some poses that he can do where he's draping the cape in front of him, because he was doing an awful lot more of that in Batman Begins than he was doing in any of the remainder 2 Nolan movies. And I feel like out of all of the bucks that they could have done that much more effectively, they could have maybe brought down the cape a few notches downwards to not only meet the clips here towards the bottom of the cowl, but also allow it to have the wires kind of encroach. I can kind of do it just a little bit right there because of the wired cape inside right there. But as you can see, it just kind of stops short of the shoulders, and I kind of wish that there was a way to press this downwards. And I feel like modders and people who do custom jobs on figures are probably going to have a field day in order to be able to fix this, because that's probably the first thing that should be on their list. And since that head is separated from the neck, you can expect the same kind of articulation for it, as well as practically the whole rest of the body, since like I said, it's pretty much taking the original Dark Knight model and just kind of adding new coats of literal paint and sculpting on top of it. So expect everything else to be ideally the same, though it does kind of favor this body just a little bit better than that original Build-A-Bane Dark Knight version, because you guys remember from that initial review that I had some problems with those arms. They weren't flushing up against the body very well. They were kind of sticking out. Sometimes it would come apart at the bicep. Did the Batman Begins version carry those problems? Well, frankly, I don't think it really did. So far, I've had a bit of a pleasant experience. The head is able to fully rotate 360, no problem, despite not needing to, considering the actual design of the cowl, but I digress at this point. Tilting is actually pretty decent upwards and downwards, as you can kind of see right there, and naturally it's also going to allow it to tilt from side to side, no problem. Then the arms, despite the severe lack of extra filling or maybe size for the shoulder guard in and of itself, it's glued down here at the bottom, so being able to rotate the arm all the way around 360 vertically is no problem, and you can definitely extend it off over to the side. However, the shoulder guard is going to come into contact a little bit with the cape at the topmost part, so do expect a little bit of resistance once you get to about that angle right there. But you do have the dumbbell joint inside, allowing just a little bit of butterfly and shrugging motion via the washer that is able to allow that to happen. But just know that this retroactively gives you an inside look of what I was talking about, where you have an awful lot of this texture work here that gives it away that this is the Dark Knight model. So you have that pattern happening right there with the washer, but you can still rotate, well, fully move from one end to the other, the bicep swivel right there, but the shoulder guard being glued down to the bottom keeps it from fully rotating 360 as I would have wanted. But the elbows are the same as the other ones, where you're able to bend the arm almost all the way, practically all the way up to the bicep, right about right there. And thankfully, you do have the flush wrist joints right here that allow the hand to be able to pivot inwards and outwards, as well as being able to rotate 360 degrees. And I will admit that despite my initial worries that the torso was going to be a little bit on the pudgy side, thankfully, not only does the paneling look just a little better in person. I don't know, I can't fully describe it. Maybe it comes across a little differently on camera, but I will admit that you can kind of see it from the side right there. And not only does the torso look a little less inflamed than it did in those initial reveal photos and footage, but also the articulation is able to kind of mask a few of those problems in and of themselves. You do have the mid-torso cut right underneath these panels, and this section part right here that's kind of cut off that allows the full upper part of the torso to fully rotate 360 degrees, as well as being able to pretty much extend towards the backside a really good amount, even though it does reveal a slight little bit of gappage happening right about right there. Crunching towards the front is also pretty decent, though not as extensive as extending towards the backside, but crunching on the obliques is also pretty achievable, as you can kind of see right about right there. And then you do have pretty much full 360 rotation on the waist. It's pretty flexible, and you can even nudge it in every direction on the waist as well. So really good movement and shifting of the torso that not only favors posability, but also is able to mask a little bit of that pudginess to kind of give you an in-depth look at the paneling that's happening for this original version of the suit, but also being able to, again, not give it so much of a gut like it did in those photos. Legs can extend about that far up, right about right there, and then they can extend back a little bit, but I'll admit there's been some McFarlanes that have been able to do a much better job than this, considering the ass sculpt, which also has that textured feel. Now, this one I can't really verify because I never had a really good look at his ass in any of the Dark Knight movies, so I am unfortunately out of luck there. Now, when it comes to the knees, however, they're able to fully bend almost all the way up, no problem, right about right there. Pretty standard issue for DC McFarlane. And then you got that flush ankle joint, right here where the boot is at, that allows the foot to pivot downwards and upwards no problem, but still pretty ratcheted right there and pretty firm. Is able to fully rotate 360 degrees at the top part of the joint and even pivot a little bit at the bottom part of the joint. So again, really love this ankle joint. The only thing I don't really love is that it is textured and painted a little bit different, a little bit more matted than the rest of the boots. So they kind of missed the memo on that. Holy shit, I actually just referenced the Batman Begins without even intending to. But that's still kind of an issue, that you have a little bit of a discrepancy in terms of texture work, because that's a little matted, and then you have the glossy finish. It's almost like, again, they might have just pulled the original ankles from the Dark Knight body and just carried it on over here and forgot to kind of apply that to there. And then you have the toesies, though they could have bent a little more high than I would have liked to, but still, they could be found right there for extra stability. So you'll notice that, yeah, you have an awful lot of the usual check marks for Batman McFarlane articulation, but at the same time, it feels a bit more fluid, and I had a much more comfortable experience than I did with the original Dark Knight Build-A-Bane body. Speaking of the devil, actually, if I want to be technical, we have two devils to cover. First will be the obvious, which is going to be the comparison to the Dark Knight version of the Bale Batman, or the Dark Knight Trilogy version, based on what McFarlane's labeling is considered. And this is the version that comes in the Build-A-Bane wave. So I decided to use this one since I feel like out of all of them, this is going to be the easier one to come across, since I know that there's a fully cloth-caped version that's included in the Ultimate Movie 6-pack, but that thing is long gone, and in order to be able to get it in the aftermarket, get ready for those scalper prices. So when you're dealing with this guy right here, you'll notice that, yeah, he's got an awful lot of more busy work happening with the body, but when you look a little closely, you'll see an awful lot of similarities. Predominantly the boots, knee pads, the actual proportioning of the sculpt work happening on the thighs. The only difference is that they just completely smoothed out the surface for the Batman Begins version, since he had a much less busier and albeit a little more simple of a suit. Ideally, the utility belt was pretty much kept the same. Of course, you're going to have almost a completely different torso that was retooled a little bit with different panels, different aesthetics. And I think one of the reasons for why this guy stands out as a little bit busy to the naked eye is, of course, the utilization of a much brighter jet black, or jet gray even, for some of those panels. Now, of course, some of you may argue that that may or may not be screen accurate, but here it just kind of helps differentiate the different versions of the suit. So overall, you see an awful lot of that happening. Now looking back, I look at the shoulder guards for the original Dark Knight version, and they do look kind of goofy of how jelly and very, it's almost like they're melting on the side of his shoulders. So I wish that that could have been maybe retrofitted a little bit better, to the point where I almost kind of wish that at this point McFarlane would come up with like a 2.0 of the Dark Knight version. And that's not including the 6-pack version, because that's effectively the same thing as this, only with the cloth cape. Here, we have that original version. You'll notice, though, as we kind of look up, you have the differences in the neck, that this one is a little bit more narrow. It's got those segmented pieces to make it look like he's got the collar from the Dark Knight movie. But then on top of that, you have the head sculpt, which is unfortunately the same. Because, again, I still stick with my guns in saying that this really could have benefited from that whole one piece for both the neck and the head, that not only would have been screen accurate, but probably would have helped sell the imagery of the figure and maybe distracted us a little bit from the shoulders. That even though I don't like the melted look of the shoulder guards, it's at least able to cover up a little bit of the skinniness happening with the joints underneath. Whereas the Batman Begins, they tried to again copy the look of the shoulder guards from that initial movie suit, but in doing so, they just created so much empty negative space around that area right there, despite going with the clips that are screen accurate. But I do appreciate that, speaking of screen accuracy, they went with the glossiness of the gauntlets, the boots. You don't find any of that happening here with the Dark Knight version. So you can see right here that, yeah, they did take some, necessary steps and notes from the original Dark Knight movie version, but they might have also created a few newfound issues along the way, of which is also the accessories that come with Batman Begins, or at least some of them. I understand that he mostly utilized the same kind of arsenal, specifically the batarangs and the grapple, from one movie to the next. But when it comes to having issues with those original accessories in the first go with this version of Batman from a toy manufacturer, you would think that you would hear the criticisms and try to at least fix some of those problems in your second turnaround. And effectively, they didn't. They simply just literally controlled C'd, controlled V'd these two particular accessories, which one of them is the Batarang, which is sculpted very beautifully and painted with the copper aesthetic there pretty nicely. But of course, the main issue is that it's completely oversized. This thing is massive. And it's painted and sculpted exactly the same as this guy right on over here. Speaking of which, we also have the Grappler, which is completely identical to that of the Build-A-Bane version. And as such, you're going to have some decent sculpting and even proportions to the grapple that he has in the movie. The only problem though, as like I had with the original version, is that it's severely lacking great amount of paint applications, specifically around the handle and this little part right here that he kind of cocks when or the little hydraulic system that he has right here underneath to be able to launch the grappler. And so little things like that, they could have gone a long way of fixing, and yet it simply just feels like they copied and pasted those exact gadgets. Now, frankly, they didn't stop right there with accessories for the Batman Begins version, because with the Dark Knight trilogy Build-A-Bane version, they had those accessories. They had a couple more Batarangs, so you had a grand total of 3 Batarangs, but then that kind of stopped for those specific accessories that came with this guy, because he was part of a Build-A-Figure wave, and as such, the rest of the plastic allocation had to be reserved for the legs that belonged to Bane that were included with this guy. Batman Begins, on the other hand, comes with 2 additional asymmetrical hand accessories, so that's pretty cool that he does have swappable hands, apart from these asymmetrical ones that he came by default that are pretty identical to that of the Dark Knight version, because he's got the fist on the left and the grappling or holding hand on the right, whichever the case may be. Whereas over here, the bonus hands, I thought to myself, well, maybe now you can actually have the grappler or the grabbing hand on the left and have the fist on the right. That's sadly not the case, but they went with something just a little bit more unique. On the right, you have this other bonus Batarang holding hand, which really stood out to me when they initially revealed this guy during the McFarlane Toy Show, because frankly, this is kind of unique, kind of clever. It has a level of dynamic aesthetic to it. It's going to favor a greater deal of poses. And again, it kind of feeds into the ninja aesthetic that he had going on in Batman Begins. The only downside, though, is that there's a little bit of paint bleed happening from both the Batarangs and the glove itself. You have a little bit of black on the underside of the Batarangs, but then on the top side, you have a little bit of that copper bleeding onto the hand itself. So that could have been a little bit more fine-tuned. But to me, the biggest problem is that this is kind of also self-reporting on how massive the standalone Batarang really is. So you'll notice that when you kind of put these guys next to each other, you'll notice just how big the Batarang is by itself when he's holding it in the other hand. So yeah, I do find that kind of funny that here they're pretty much admitting that there's a major size discrepancy when it comes to the Batarang. So they could have maybe had a little bit of an introspective look at that. Now, when it comes to this other left hand, at first I thought it was just another fisted hand, and I'm like, why did they duplicate the same fisted hand, or is this the right fisted hand, and I'm not looking at it straightforward? But when you take a little bit of a closer look, you'll notice that on the inside, he's actually holding one of the grenades from Batman Begins. So I thought that was actually pretty cool that I kind of missed that the first go around, and taking a closer look, you'll see you have the little kind of like spheres that kind of poke out when the grenade gets activated, when he kind of blows open the door during the Arkham Asylum raid. Again, kind of wish that we would have added some paint decal to make it stand out a little bit more. And I feel like people who do custom and modding jobs are going to have a field day with that one. But at the same time, it's like we have to do half the work here, McFarlane, and admittedly, that is getting just a little trite. And if I could keep piling on the hand accessories, I kind of wish that they would have swapped orientation. I wish that the Batarang holding one was the left, and then the grenade one was the right, because at least this one's kind of resembling a fist, and it would have been kind of neat to at least have something that resembles a fist on the right. And since you can already hold the Batarang on the right with that open hand, then why have this 3 kind of ninja style Batarang hand be on the right as well? So I kind of wish that they would have played a little bit with that right there. What they did play around with, however, is the second devil that I want to bring onto the screen here, who's technically more of a devil, or I guess by technical terms, more of a demon than anything else. This is truly where they got really playful and creative for their gold label Target exclusive, which is going to be the Demon Batman from the scene where he's interrogating Scarecrow after giving him his own taste of his medicine doctor. And when some of those leaks started to make the rounds on the internet and they were saying that, oh, there was going to be a Batman Begins figure, but there was also going to be a platinum chase for it, almost everybody in the community collectively knew that that platinum needed to be Demon Batman. I mean, come on. It just kind of writes in and of itself. And so I wanted to kind of sandwich in him a little bit, almost quite literally, into this review, because he's effectively the same exact thing as this Batman Begins body in terms of tooling, sculpting, articulation, the creation of the cape and how it's applied. Almost everything is identical except, of course, two very major differences. One of which is, of course, that demon head. Just look at that head. It's really well done. Albeit, I feel like the proportions of the face are just a little bit too big. They're a little bit oversized. I don't know if maybe that was a creative choice to kind of bring out the details and kind of add a little bit more attention to the figure and focus to the head sculpt to be like, hey, look, this is the Demon Batman. And so you have an awful lot of those little ridges that I think looked a little bit better in the movie, but I feel like this is also kind of lifting a little bit of the concept art for Demon Batman for the pre-production of Batman Begins. Because even the mouth is a bit more skeletal-like. I don't remember it being too much like that in the movie, and he's missing a great amount of that goo. Would have been a nice little touch to apply a little bit of this sheen paint applications that he's got going on for the gauntlets and the boots, and then apply it to like the chin to make it look like he's drooling that oil slick kind of bloody stuff from that sequence, and that would have been amazing. That's also an idea for some of you custom people, modding people. That's a really good thing to firstly apply if you get your hands on the Demon Batman. And then as you kind of navigate downwards, you'll notice that yes, he definitely has a different paint application kind of coursing through the majority of the panels here. It's kind of looking a little streaky. It kind of has like this, it's almost like it's using a little bit of the hue for the Dark Knight version, but then it's kind of creating like this streaking, splotching, kind of messy look to the brushness of the surface on the panels. So you have that difference kind of carried on through right there. It's a little inconsistent when you start to get a little close and start to analyze certain panels and parts of the body, specifically around the boots, where I do feel like it's faded in correctly on one boot shield right there, but then on the shin on the other, it's a little too separated that I feel like, again, it loses a little bit of consistency across the board. And speaking of inconsistency, I don't know how I necessarily feel about the fact that the hands do have the paint application for the Demon Batman applied to the default hands, but then the accessories are completely identical to that of Batman Begins, including the hands. The hands, the alternate hands with the batarangs in between the fingers and the bomb don't have that little blue tint aesthetic to them. So I'm like, all right, so if I was to swap out the hands, then they're going to either stand out because they're going to look exactly like the ones on the Batman Begins, or if I have them kind of hanging about, I could kind of mix and match them and end up losing them. So they can kind of be swapped out for either one. And I kind of wish that they would have been a little consistent with that in applying that paint application to the bonus hands. The Batarang and the grapple, I expected to be the same, and that's why I didn't really bother pulling them out. But the hands could have added a little bit of that paint to then make it much more fitting of the Demon Batman, which in my opinion, between these two, it's kind of winning me over a little bit, but I feel like that's maybe on unique bias because of the fact that he's got the different sheen and coat of paint onto the panels. He's utilizing the bulk of this guy that feels a little bit more simplistic, but then you have that demon head sculpt. And even though I could have used a little bit more refinement on the features and maybe a little splash of goo coming out of the mouth, still, I dig it. And it's within McFarlane's wheelhouse of building on that horror factor that it's arguably becoming the winner out of the two. And thus, for the first time on the channel, if I wanted to give separate ratings to both a essential figure but also its gold label counterpart, I would say that the Batman Begins body is a must-have pickup for those who are trying to complete the overall movie set, but for everybody else, it's probably going to be a really, really good 7 out of 10 because, again, I feel like they could have done so many things to fix, like some of the gadgetry, some of the accessories, and then, like I said, so much tooling of the body is doing some things right, but for every one or two things that they did right, there's also another thing done wrong or something that could have been done a little better, specifically, like I said, around the shoulder area, and again, that goddamn headpiece that could have been all one piece instead of segmented pieces, and maybe even given a cloth cape, considering that he had a much clothier material for the cape in that first movie than he even did in Dark Knight or Dark Knight Rises. So I don't understand why we had to kind of carry on over nylon for that fabric. But then elevating it to a notch above would be the Demon Batman because of that head sculpt, because it's taking the right parts of the Batman Begins body, but then with this new coat of paint that gives it that level of uniqueness and that horror factor that then elevates it to an 8 out of 10. And then, of course, there's that scarcity, there's that level of FOMO, considering that it's a Target exclusive, and therefore, I feel like if you come across it when you're shopping for your groceries at Target, do not hesitate to pick it up, especially if you are a fan of this movie that's turning 20 years, and it couldn't have come at a better time. And again, some things could have been done a little bit better, but to checkbox that section of the collection that was being fit by Batman Begins, this is honestly not a bad setup to kind of close out this chapter of the Christian Bale Batman era, Dark Knight trilogy, Christopher Nolan era. And now it's time to just move on to either more of the Reeves stuff, more of the upcoming DCU stuff, and maybe along the way, finally give us our last one that's missing, which is that Justice League Batfleck Batman. For now though, if you're out there in the wild hunting down the Batman Begins figure as well as its gold label, Target exclusive Demon Batman counterpart, please let me know down below. How are you guys' hunt going right now? I'm seeing so many more people posting their photos on Reddit, on the Facebook groups, and it's kind of becoming a bit more of a frequent thing. So I think slowly but surely they're starting to turn out outside of just the West Coast, because for a while it seemed like it was just a West Coast thing, and now it looks like it's starting to trickle down into the Midwest, into the Eastern Seaboard, and then hopefully by the time you're watching this video, pre-orders for either of these, well, mainly for this guy as well as a couple of others that are part of this wave, are going to start to make the rounds online. But when it comes to Demon Batman, may the odds be ever in your favor. And while you guys are letting me know how you feel about these figures and your experiences hunting them down in the comment section, go ahead and hit the thumbs up button if you enjoyed this video, thumbs down if you did not, and as always, stay humble, and I'll catch you later.